Hello, I'm Ed Hoffman, Director of NASA's Academy for Program Project and Engineering Leadership, and welcome to Masters with Masters. In this program, we feature two master practitioners who share their reflections and thoughts on their career at NASA. I'd like to welcome our audience today. We have members from NASA First joining us who will have the opportunity to ask questions of our guests. I'd like to start by welcoming Lynn Cline and Mike Hawes, who will be our discussion participants for today. Lynn Cline is NASA's Deputy Associate Administrator for Space Operations. In that responsibility, she manages the portfolio of space operations that includes Space Shuttle, International Space Station, the Launch Services Program, Space Communications and Navigation, and Crew Health and Safety. Before assuming her current position, Lynn had a Deputy Assistant Administrator for External Relations, where she was responsible for NASA's interaction with executive branch offices and agencies and for international relations. She led the U.S. delegations to the United Nations Committee on Peaceful Uses for Outer Space, and she also served as NASA's lead negotiator on the agreements with Canada, Europe, Japan, and Russia for the International Space Station. Please welcome Lynn Cline.
Thank you.
Mike Hawes is the Associate Administrator for the Office of Independent Program and Cost Evaluation at NASA. In this capacity, he's responsible for providing objective studies and analyses in support of policy programs and budget decisions by the NASA Administrator. Prior to that, he served as the Deputy Associate Administrator for Program Integration in the Office of Space Operations. In that capacity, he was charged with the transition and disposition of Space Shuttle assets as that program starts to close down. He's also had a long career in human exploration, serving as the Senior Assistant to the Associate Administrator for Space Operations, focused on the Space Shuttle's return to flight. From 1999 to 2002, he served as the Deputy Associate Administrator for the International Space Station, with responsibilities that included directing the station budget, establishing and implementing policy and coordinating external communications, and serving as the liaison with the administration, Congress, industry, and the station's international partners. At the start of his career, he served on the mission control team for the Skylab reentry. Please welcome Mike Hawes. I've known both Lynn and Mike for quite a long time, and they have a very common path in terms of a lot of work around human exploration on our major missions, as well as working with our international partners. As a starting point to talk about your careers, I'd like to ask, from Lynn, your standpoint, you started as a co-op at NASA, and you've had an interesting career path in doing just about everything, it seems, at NASA. Can you talk a little bit about how you got started and how you mapped out and worked your career?
Right. Well, I actually came in just for what was supposed to be a 3-month assignment. I was a French language major at East Carolina University, and the chairman of the language department called and asked if I would like to go to work at NASA because they had a co-op opening in the International Affairs Office. So I came in for 3 months. And bottom line is I just got so fascinated with the work, I decided to completely reorient my career, and I wanted to come back to NASA a second time. So I went back to school, crammed in every last course I could so that I could come back for a second co-op term. And when I finished that co-op term, I converted to full-time permanent. So I turned that 3-month assignment into what's now a 35-year career. And along the way, I guess the main lesson I learned is I didn't really map out my career very well myself, because whatever job I thought was my next logical move turned out to be wrong. Mostly I got recruited by management or offered an opportunity to go in a different direction that I personally hadn't been considering. So, for example, I was working on space and earth science, very happy doing that, negotiating agreements, and I got a new boss who came in and said, Lynn, I'm putting you in charge of our relationship with Russia, and I want you to lead the negotiations for the space station program. I was ready to, I actually had applied to become our NASA European rep in Paris, which for many years was my dream job, and my boss came and asked me to withdraw my application and please become his deputy instead, in charge of external relations. And then I was recruited by what was then the Office of Space Flight to come down and head their policy and planning group. And when I went in to talk to Bill Reedy to accept that job, he said, "I've changed my mind. I want you to be my deputy instead." So that's kind of how my career went.
So you had plans, but they always went in different directions.
Yes.
And Mike, what about you?
I was the stereotypical space cadet kid that somehow stumbled into engineering through the science and math kind of gateways. I also was the kid who tended to take all of my toys and things apart and occasionally get them back together. But I also became fascinated with the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs as I was growing up. So I decided I was going to go work in the space program, having absolutely no clue how to do it, but get a bachelor's of aerospace engineering degree from Notre Dame, and then just happened to stumble into the hiring when particularly JSC was getting ready to fly shuttle. So I started at JSC in 1978, which was at that time we said a year away from launch, and then it continued to be a year away from launch. But I spent my first almost 10 years at JSC working in mission control. Like Lynn, I can't say that all of my career choices have been choices. I think I fit in the non-conventional kind of career path that doing things that are kind of new and different for the agency, I tend to have moves just made. And so at the time of Challenger, when President Reagan decided we were no longer going to deploy commercial satellites from the space shuttle, that's exactly what I was doing. In fact, my title was section head of the Commercial Payload Operations Section. So that spoke to a career move that wasn't exactly planned. And then I was recruited to come to the Space Station Freedom Program office in Reston. And after about 6 years, the agency decided that they wanted to go in another direction. But by that time, we had decided we were Virginians, not Texans, and so we stayed in the Washington area, and I have worked since at headquarters. So things just seem to happen, and generally there's a lot of fascinating things to do at NASA, so they seem to work out.
So both of you had, Mike, you had more of a traditional expectation. You wanted to work at NASA, and when you started as a co-op with the expectation of 3 months, and then doing something else with your French studies. Both of you, it sounds like you had plans, but you had to in many cases, totally redirect them. Do you think that's typical of a career? Do you think that worked out well for you, or do you throw out the career planning or just do it? Or what do you think about that from a standpoint of your experiences?
I would say it's worked out well for me, and it's not that you throw out the career planning. It's just that you need to be flexible to realize that there's always multiple paths. There's always several different things that any of us can do, and at different points in your career, your interest and your family situation will kind of weight things differently. So you may want to pursue different paths. But I've always had a plan. I've always had an idea of what's interesting, what's attractive, what kinds of things do I want to do, and sometimes they work out, and sometimes you're on the other plan.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the most important thing is to find something you really like to do. And what I found is if I did all the career planning for myself, I think I would have limited myself. There were other people who saw things in me that I didn't appreciate. And so it really made me stop and think, oh, well, maybe I could do that. Or, gee, I never thought about that. That sounds really interesting. So I think the most important thing is to just be open. So the planning part is understanding what kinds of things you like to do, and maybe the serendipity part is be open if somebody makes a suggestion that you hadn't come up with on your own.
Right. So the notion that other people, mentors or key people, kind of see that you can do other things, or they expect you to do other things that maybe you wouldn't have thought about throughout that. And in looking back at your careers, you've all worked in human explorations, the international partnering negotiations aspect. Was there a time where you started being aware of working together in terms of space operations, or just from the standpoint of your careers?
I can remember back to, it was after Reston, when I came down to headquarters and started working in the Office of Spaceflight, and I actually had a short break from Space Station after that, but in '95, Dr. Wayne Littles asked me to be chief engineer for the Space Station office in spaceflight, and it was shortly after that I think I became aware of Lynn working in external relations, doing all the partner negotiations. We were just we were a bit down the road of bringing the Russians into the program. But that's what I recall.
Yeah, I started working on station in '93 when we invited Russia into the program. And at the very beginning of my career, I started out with Apollo-Soyuz test projects. So I did human space flight. I worked on some of the foreign partners using Spacelab, like the D1 mission for Germany. Then I went off and worked primarily space and earth science for a large portion of my career. And it was in that early '90s that I was pulled back into human space flight. And then, of course, when I moved down to the Office of Space Flight, Mike was there, and so we worked together quite closely at that point.
Right. You both obviously had very strong experience, still do, with the International Space Station. Tremendous success, particularly from the standpoint of working, basically building a home and a laboratory and a place to work with, so many different nations being involved and having pride there. Can you talk to what are the lessons of working such a strongly international mission, and what are the lessons also NASA learns from working with our international partners? Mike, maybe I'll start with you.
There are a lot of challenges to work in international projects, obviously, and many of our projects do have an international flavor. The things that have been important to me over the years of Space Station have been having processes that can bring those partners together, whether it's agreeing on engineering standards, interfaces, software, program decisions, the timing of those program decisions, the varying political impact for each one of the partners. You need a great deal of sensitivity and patience, I think, to be able to really work in that environment. But I think we recognize that the sum is much bigger than the collection of all the parts.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that each of the partners have different goals. They're not identical, they're overlapping, they're complementary, and you really need to understand what each partner is needing from the partnership, what's important to them politically at home, where they have key players, and having some understanding of that helps you through this terrain of negotiating different aspects. I think it's also important that, as Mike was talking about, a mechanism to bring people together. It's important you have a framework to work through that everybody recognizes as that method. One of the things I've seen over the years working on international agreements is that we've gotten more and more precise, more detailed in the agreements. And what happens when there's a problem in a project, the project manager's gut reaction is, on the next agreement, I'm going to write this down in great detail so this will never be questioned again. If you go back and look at the original agreement with the European Space Agency for Hubble, it's like a 5 or 10 page agreement. The Space Station Memoranda of Understanding are 30-some-odd pages. And so you feel a little bit better that you're getting more precise and everybody's on the same page. But the downside to that is, especially for something like Space Station that's going to last many years, what you thought you wanted to do at the beginning may not necessarily be what you need to implement later. And so you need to be flexible. You need to have a framework that lays out sort of the top-level ground rules, but then you better have good mechanisms. So all of these multilateral bodies where you're talking about standards and procedures. You need to have those where people can implement the new problems that come up or the new questions you need to deal with, because those things change over time.
One of the interesting things about Space Station and the way the MOUs were structured that Lynn had worked on is the early relationship for the development time frame was actually bilateral, the United States to each one of the partners. And so in the early days when I was out at Reston, the whole dialogue was more driven by these individual bilateral relationships where you would have joint program reviews with each one of the partners. But the MOUs also had envisioned this multilateral mode of operating the space station and working that transition and moving from dealing with one partner at a time to having everybody at the table, all of the discussions in a multilateral sense, was quite a challenge. And it was, so now we're in a situation where the flight control teams deal with control centers all over the world, and that multilateral process happens every day in mission management teams and activities. So it's been a fascinating progression to watch.
Yeah, and I think at the beginning, NASA was not convinced consensus would work. We wanted to have control. We were the lead. We had to have final decision rights. It's an operational program. You couldn't be put in a position where you'd reach an impasse and no decision could be made. But it's turned out that we do most things by consensus. And part of that is it's a single integrated facility. Anything that we do affects all of the partners. And we all have a common interest in seeing the program succeed. And that's a powerful motivator for bringing people together.
So in addition to the typical challenges of an incredibly complex mission of cost and schedule and the requirements, you're talking about this layer of the human aspects and really the political mapping of different partners with different requirements and setting up agreements, but making sure the agreements are flexible enough to be able to adapt and in a consensual kind of mode. I mean, from the starting point, because what you were doing had not been done before, where do you start when you're negotiating something this large? I mean, how do you... I mean, there's no place you can turn to initially for a starting point.
The negotiator.
Okay.
Well, we actually did a little bit of analysis of how things went between NASA and Europe on the Space Lab mission and took some of those lessons learned into account. We also did some research on what the capabilities were of each partner to try and figure out what would be the ideal contributions from each of the partners. And then because we wanted to keep that leadership role, the decision was made to do a series of bilateral negotiations. Now, this became very interesting. So I wasn't involved in that first round of negotiations. So when I came in to bring Russia into the program, we had existing agreements that had gone through that whole process. And because we had existing agreements with Canada, Europe, and Japan, before we could propose anything to Russia, especially if it was going to be different from what was in the existing agreements, I had to go convince the other partners that this was a reasonable change. So we actually set up a consultative group with the original partnership that we used it as a sounding board, essentially, to get their buy-in. Then I'd go off and negotiate with Russia. We'd get some of it, not all of it, and then I'd have to come back and I'd have to work it back with the partners again. And so I saw some very interesting dynamics. When I was just with the original partners, they had concerns that somehow they were going to be set aside, not as important, because Russia had such a huge capacity. They're going to be playing a major role like the United States, and they were a little bit worried about that. And they had concerns with Russia. They would express to the U.S., but they would never say in front of Russia. Meanwhile, Russia had concerns about the original partners, but they said, they're your partners, you take care of it. So I found myself in this interesting sort of, okay, you got to be the bad guy with the Russians, you got to go take care of this. They wanted the U.S. to be the lead and do all of those things on their behalf. And when you got in a multilateral meeting with all of them together, every complaint they had, every change they wanted to make, none of them would get voiced. But I knew that if I didn't raise them and negotiate on them, then we'd be stuck. And so it was a very interesting group dynamic to have to work with.
Multiple relationships, and you're having to facilitate this. And so from an implementation standpoint, obviously it's not negotiations and then it's done. You have to work with something. How does that impact the implementation and just, where we are today?
One of the challenges that we had, as I said, was this transition from bilateral to multilateral forms of discussion. And towards the end of the Reston time, Bob Moorhead, the program manager, said to me, okay, you're the ops guy. You need to start this multilateral thing, whatever it's going to be. You need to start this. So we started a first multilateral integration forum amongst the partners and got a little bit of a head start on those processes, and then they rolled into the ISS as the ISS was forming up. So when I was in the space station job with Lynn's help, and I think it was Angela Diaz at the time, we actually started to hold the multilateral coordination board that was called out in the MOUs as that's going to be the multilateral forum for all of these discussions, and we actually started to hold those on a regular basis. We moved them around all the partner sites so that everybody was represented and started to deal with the issues that we saw coming. Now, there were some things that kind of changed because the Russian involvement was very different. We were going to be using the Soyuz. We were going to have a lot of Russian crews, so we had to kind of spin out some other discussion bodies as part of that. Working with the Russians was kind of structured in a somewhat different way, like Lynn said, so we had to do stuff with Russians and then kind of reflect that back to the rest of the partnership. But most of it was just getting started. The big step is getting started, and then eventually flowing that down to that all the activities at the program level were taking place, in that multilateral mode, where we do mission planning, increment planning, crew training and planning, all over time have gone that path, that they're multilateral activities now.
Yeah, and if you look back at the structure of the agreements, the way they're set up is that a partner's ability to have crew on board and to do their utilization begins when their element is delivered. And so these things got sequenced over time. So in the early stages, it was primarily U.S. and Russia because we had the first elements launched. Then you added the robotic system for Canada, and ultimately you had the European and Japanese labs. So it got implemented over time. The other thing is, we had in the original agreements this sort of bright line between, okay, here's development and assembly, where you're in this bilateral relationship, and then you flip a switch, and now we're in this ops and utilization mode. And that all got blended over time as assembly got stretched out, and we started utilization as soon as we could. And so I think we've been operating more multilaterally a lot longer than the agreements really foresaw.
Well, we spent a lot longer in assembly.
That's right.
Yeah. What are the key lessons, perhaps, you have from, if you're going to offer up to someone who's going to be doing similar negotiations or implementation in future international collaborations for the next key missions? What are the things that really stand out in your mind of, let's remember this or learn from that?
There's a couple things that I would think. One, from a technical standpoint, and Lynn alluded to it a bit. Generally we would always look at, say, the industry contractors that bid on our projects, and we would assess their strengths and weaknesses and factor that into the risks that we see in developing a project budget and schedule. You need to do the same thing with your partners. You need to be, I think, very aware of what their capabilities are. Are they trying to do something new? Are they trying to do something that they have done well in the past? And while there's plenty of reasons to still have that partnership, you need to try to factor that into your own planning for the project. And then the other piece I would just say is that the relationship is critical. You really need to be willing to spend the time, and frequently for these programs that means the miles and the travel, and Gerst is still stuck somewhere in Europe,
Amsterdam
right? Yeah.
at the moment.
But that really makes the relationship work.
Yeah. Relationships are very important. One of the things that we did during the negotiations was we ensured we had some time for social activity outside of the negotiations and got to know one another, learn about your families, your hobbies, where you go on vacation, just get to know one another as people. And that helped build bridges so that when you got to a really tough discussion, people didn't take it personally, and you could be professional. And if you needed to talk quietly outside of the negotiating room, those relationships helped you get through some of those tough times. And I would say a couple other things I would recommend, coming back to this point about flexibility. Whatever agreement you're going to put in place, make it an enabling agreement. Put in some management bodies that allow you to adapt as you need to in the future. And then I think the other thing is if there's a way to look at expanding the partnership without having to renegotiate the entire agreement, that would be a good thing. Because with Station, you really didn't have a choice. I mean, it's a single integrated facility. You share all the resources. Everybody affects everyone else. But what that meant was when we decided to invite Russia to join the program, we had to completely renegotiate all the agreements. You couldn't just add a partner because you had to redivide all the resources. If you have a distributed program of some kind, then it's easier to bring other partners in. So if you're going to have a long-term human exploration activity, you might want to look at, is there a way to allow accession of new partners without having to go back to square one.
And I think folks may forget that we operated in the original partnership for 9 or 10 years before we invited the Russians to join. So those processes and those relationships and the kind of the needs and goals of all the partners were pretty well set at that time. And that was actually a pretty big change to accommodate in.
Yeah. Although I will say that while they were set on the original agreements, when it came time to do the new negotiations to bring Russia in, the original view of all of the partners was minimal changes. We had this philosophy of minimalism. We're going to kind of add Russia to the list of countries. We're going to add what they're providing, and everything else will stay the same. That was the going-in position, which, of course, wasn't going to work. Russia had stronger ideas about how this should be. But once we reopened the agreements, then Europe came in with a completely new approach, a whole bunch of non-negotiable demands that if we're going to stay in this partnership, we need to have all of these changes. And so that then gave me a second front of things I had to go work in the negotiations. And the Japanese were, don't change anything. We reached consensus on all of this. We don't want anything new. And Canada was somewhere in the middle. They were pretty flexible. So we had to work through all of those things.
Yeah, the relationships. Let's see what questions we have from our audience.
This question is for you, Lynn. In bringing in a partner like Russia, what is the single most, biggest challenge of bringing in somebody like that? Or is there a single one that was the most challenging?
Yeah, I think what was challenging about bringing Russia in is Russia was a very mature partner who had tremendous expertise in human space flight. And they had been flying space stations for many, many years. So they came in with a great deal of expertise and national pride and viewed themselves as, at the forefront of this field. And here we were starting out on this space station feeling exactly the same way. And so bringing together those two cultures at the beginning, it was like having each of us sitting there thinking, I'm better than you are. And once you could get people to talk to one another and recognize we had the same goals, we both had engineering expertise, and actually we had good complementary skills because NASA, working with the shuttle, had been doing a lot of short duration but very complex missions, and Russia had great expertise in long duration space flight with their stations, and they'd learned a lot of lessons. And once we had our teams working together, and we had a cosmonaut fly on the shuttle, we had an astronaut go to Mir, and we started to learn from one another. And as soon as people recognize we actually can learn from one another, then it sort of spread, and you got beyond that. But it was bringing two very different cultures with a lot of pride together and getting them to recognize that we could learn from one another.
But we did learn that we actually engineered some things differently, from a technical standpoint, and it took a while, not just with the translation, but really kind of building, we called it a lexicon at the time of, well, what does certification mean to you? What does verification mean to you? What do these kinds of test modes? And I think the biggest I remember was we never could resolve pressure testing of modules because the Russians just put it in a big thermal vac chamber and pull the pressure down and test the integrity of the module. We tend to overpressure. We bag on the outside of the module. We overpressure to make sure nothing leaks on the outside. And the Russians were convinced that was not, the metallurgy was different. That was not going to test the same phenomena. And if you think back, we ended up reactivating the thermal vac chamber in the O&C building down at KSC really just for that reason. So we did the lab and the airlock in that thermal vac chamber down at Kennedy just because we never really could quite get to that agreement until then we tested, and now we've flown those modules, so we have better agreement what we do. So it takes a while to, and I think that was the fact that we had not done anything with the Russians since Apollo Soyuz and really had a lot of catching up to do, if you will.
Yes, my question is for both of you. I guess it's more of a career-oriented question. You mentioned that you had received a lot of opportunities because mentors suggested that things that they saw in you that maybe you didn't see in you. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more to how you go about deciding whether an opportunity is the right opportunity for you versus just a great opportunity or a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
Good luck. I think you have to do one of the things, as Lynn alluded to, having mentors or having folks that you trust that are a little further in their career path, whether they're formal mentors or informal mentors that you can ask questions about things, even talking to your peers about different opportunities is tough. I would guess most of my jumps I was not really that introspective about. You have to decide, is it a reasonable path for me given where I think I want to end up maybe 2 or 3 steps down the road? Is it a reasonable thing for my family and for the situation that I've got now? But for me, it was mostly talking to my peers and my mentors that convinced me that it was a reasonable path to take.
Yes, I did the same. There's some people that you know well, that you trust. And what's good about going and asking other people is they'll think of things you hadn't, both pros and cons. But in the end, it's your decision. So you have to kind of weigh all of those. But it's good to get some other thoughts on what that kind of a career move will do for you. And even to have somebody ask you good questions about, well, what about this? Have you thought about that? Why do you want this?
Lynn, you talked earlier about kind of understanding the relationships between your partners and understanding the different political motivations and other motivations that they have. I was curious what you see as some of kind of the basic philosophical differences between NASA as a space agency and some of the motivations and the expectations of our partners that we work with.
I think we actually have quite a lot in common. The differences tend to be more what are the political drivers at that time. So, is a mission driven by their science community and science priorities? Is it driven by the industrial return that they have to have for their nation? And they need industrial return, and their prime company has a certain expertise. Therefore, there's a piece of technology that they have to work on in order for it to be politically feasible at home. Those kinds of things. So that it's not that they're completely different, going in a different direction, but that you just need to figure out which ones are more drivers for them.
The other thing that we learned over time was that each partner had really a different timing. We had our natural budget process where in February you kick off with the president's budget and then you go through the congressional hearings. And so we had to condition the partners of, okay, during these months you're going to hear all kinds of strange things, and that's where the big posturing thing happens. And during these kind of months we can't really talk to you. We can't talk about anything that's in the budget. Well, they each had their own version of that, and so we became very attuned to what are their budget cycles. What is their, like for ESA, it's everything is decided at the next ministerial meeting. Whenever is that going to be? Typically in the fall, but it's always the next ministerial meeting that you're waiting for a proclamation from ESA. And the no changes from the Japanese seem to be driven by they had a complicated, convoluted ministerial structure in Japan that was a challenge to work things through. So you have to get an awareness of not just the partner's needs, and industrial base, as Lynn said, is a big one. It really does factor a lot of things. But the way they have to work their own politics is really important. And the more you're sensitive to that, I think the more it helps you find common agreements.
Yeah, we all know that the Japanese fiscal year begins on April 1 because we could never move a launch date from March into April without going through very long, involved discussions and careful timing as to when it was announced.
Yes, good morning. Thanks for your time today. I was wondering if you could pull out your crystal balls and let us know what you think in terms of the next 2 to 5 years, the types of projects that we will be doing with our international partners.
Well, first and foremost, a space station. One of the things I did last summer was lead the NASA team that supported Norm Augustine's review committee, and they heard loud and clear from the existing space station partners that extension of the ISS till 2020 was the fundamental thing that they all were interested in. So I think finishing assembly and fully utilizing ISS is the first piece of that.
Yeah, and then as you look beyond that, clearly the current administration has a strong emphasis on international cooperation, and these new programs that we have in the fiscal 11 budget, I think NASA is going to be looking to see what interest other partners have in some of those areas, whether they're robotic precursor missions or technology demonstrations. Are there ways that we can work together and pool our resources as we plan for future exploration?
Hi, this question is for both of you. We have had some intense discussions about the culture of NASA, and so I was wondering how you integrated your experience with the culture of NASA with your international partners and their culture.
They are the culture of NASA.
Yeah, that's my perspective of the culture of NASA coming out of the, mission operations, engineering kind of world would be, very mission focused, very data focused. Yes, there's some place for emotion, but not unless you have data to back it up. Is kind of the culture that I was raised in. And so I had a lot of early dealings with some international partners that were flying satellites on the shuttle. So I started on that path and then had spent time, particularly in Europe, dealing with a number of different companies that were going to fly hardware on the shuttle. So I had a beginning experience with that and found that we could always kind of, the physics is the same. And so for me, when you start the discussion with the physics, it's a lot easier to build towards then what are the other maybe tougher, intangible kinds of things that everybody has to deal with.
Yeah, and I think Mike has the advantage of working more in the implementation part where you've got the ongoing program and you can get to that. I worked on a lot of activities from the External Relations Office where you're just forming partnerships, you're just negotiating agreements. And there it's harder to get down to that practical stuff because they're trying to figure out how to advocate a program with their political environment and lots of other drivers that come out. And so trying to get the conversation down to the, oh, I understand what you want to do, but from a pragmatic perspective, you know, this is what makes sense, this is what our scientific priorities are, or you know, from an operational perspective, we can't do it that way. Getting down to that can be difficult. And I guess one of the cultural differences I don't think we ever solved during the space station negotiations is the American habit of being total workaholics who will work weekends, holidays, and all of our partners who view every single holiday as sacred. And one of the hardest things to do was to pick the next date for the negotiations that wasn't a holiday somewhere around the world. And mostly, we gave up the American holidays in order to get the negotiations because we were the only culture willing to do that.
And you had more lawyers to deal with, too.
Yeah, well, we did have a lot of lawyers to deal with.
Let's talk maybe about the global exploration strategy. Mike, you were involved in 2006 in the development of the global exploration strategy, working with 13 other space agencies. You indicated that was an opportunity for NASA to kind of open up its thought processes. What did you get out of that, and what are some of the lessons and ideas we experienced there?
Well, I think Lynn alluded to it a little bit earlier as well, and I was actually doing this as Lynn and Bill Gerstenmaier's agent for this time, is working with the Exploration Systems Mission Directorate. One of the things, while it was somewhat of an opportunity, was that there was a possibility, and Lynn talked about having a more distributed program where you don't have to tie everything together in one facility like a space station. So it seems like there's more opportunity not only for more countries to participate, different countries, different experience and skill levels, you know, because you have a wider spectrum of capabilities that you might be interested in. The other thing that I think we looked at is, you know, you already see several countries going to the moon with robotic spacecraft, and that's kind of because that's how mature that their programs are today, and so that's within capture range. So we've seen the Chinese, the Japanese, the Indians send spacecraft to the moon, and they'll continue to go further, but that's where their capabilities are today, and they're very interested in those missions. ESA, we recognize, have other capabilities. They've been very Mars-focused, and you know, we're building a very close Mars program between ESA and NASA today. So I think the opportunity to me was that I saw that you could structure the program so that you could actually have more participants and at very different ability and experience levels in terms of flying.
So greater opportunities by using the different skills and capabilities around the world. And Lynn, you led a U.S. delegation to the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which again seems like obviously it's a very global kind of thing. What were some of the lessons that you experienced and pick up from that?
That was a very, very different environment because all of the other projects I'd worked on over the years, we already had a project we wanted to do together, a willingness to work in some area together. We decided we were going to do the Galileo mission to Jupiter or the Cassini mission to Saturn. When you get in the UN committee, first of all, it's, I don't know, 90 member states or something like that. Most of them do not have space programs, but everyone has an equal voice. And it's driven very much by the interests of developing countries. And by and large, they're interested in space applications, space for development of their nations. So they're mostly interested in communications, remote sensing, those kinds of things. Very limited interest in space science and not much discussion about human space flight. just finding a common denominator among all of those parties was a challenge. And then figuring out of all of these different players what was a reasonable path forward. And one of the lessons I learned early was the United States is viewed as sort of maybe bad guy's the wrong word, but sort of we're the big, powerful, superpower space nation. We have all this capability, and so why aren't we just freely giving it away to all of these developing countries and teaching them everything they need to know and just giving them data? And so being suddenly put in this position where, you know, what have you done for me lately? You're not doing enough. Why aren't you helping us? Was a difficult position to be in. And I also learned that if the proposal, because of that sort of view of the U.S., if the proposal came from the U.S., then it would quickly be dismissed. So I got quite good at behind-the-scenes negotiations. And so what I would do is work with another country who was willing to make whatever the proposal was that we wanted. And then I'd go around and I'd get as many co-sponsors. And the one I did best on was our work plan going forward to mitigate orbital debris. And we got Germany to propose the plan. I even got China and India and Brazil to co-sponsor the plan. So it was all a U.S. proposal that we developed in partnership with Germany. But because it came from somebody other than the U.S., we were able to get it accepted and go forward. So learning to maneuver behind the scenes instead of being out in front was a whole different approach to cooperation.
So building the alliances and the coalitions become even more important.
Yes.
Both of you, from the way you're talking, seem to perhaps be indicating that the future is going to be more of a global strategy for space and exploration and science, or am I reading too much?
No, I think definitely. You know, we have learned that. We've learned that through all of the projects that we've done internationally, and certainly in a big way with Space Station. We have learned the real advantages of that, and, you know, obviously, you know, we've looked at the plan never anticipated anything as tragic as the Columbia accident, but the fact that we kept crew on Space Station and we kept it supplied through primarily Russia with the Soyuz in progress, I think tells us that there's, you know, a huge advantage to having international projects, that you have resources available to the program that come from a lot of different sources. So this administration as well, we see as very focused internationally, but I think that meets well with our own experience.
And through this process of developing the global exploration strategy and then establishing the International Space Exploration Consultative or Coordination Group that came out of that, one of the most important things that does for us is keep a dialogue going so that everyone is talking about what their planning is, what their thinking is. You can't just suddenly say, okay, here's the project, everybody sign up. Everyone needs time to figure out what their role in it is, what their interest is, how they work it up through their management chain and then through their government process. And so, you know, Station didn't start just with an announcement by the President that we were going to go do this program. There had been years of discussions in advance with the partners to pave the way so that when the President made such an announcement, they'd be prepared to accept the invitation. So a lot of what we're doing now is that necessary dialogue. So at whatever time you coalesce into this is the plan going forward, you will have the partners ready to join you.
A lot of communication for things that happen years later or benefit, it sounds like.
Yes.
This is for Lynn or both of you, really. Doing negotiations with the Russians at the time you did in the early 90s seems like a very daunting task. How did you prepare yourself, I mean, on multiple levels, you know, intellectually and emotionally, for taking that on? You know, you've done it with the Europeans but not the Russians before.
Yeah, there were a number of challenges to that, one of which was the Russians coming in and saying they didn't want to deal with a woman. And my boss basically said, well, if you want to be involved in station, you're going to have to deal with Lynn. So that was a first challenge. Another challenge an advantage I had for the first round was because we had these existing international agreements with Canada, Europe, and Japan that we could not change, and because Russia needed to be talking to us right away. Actually, the first round of negotiations was an interim agreement to just get Russia to buy into the text we already had, and then the full-up negotiations where we could open the language would come as a second step. So for that interim agreement, I was in the perfect position of saying, take it or leave it. That's the language. I can't change it. And the Russians found that incredibly annoying. But it was helpful in kind of gauging what kinds of things they're coming from. We had, during the course of the negotiations, before we started on the negotiations, we actually took a little short class on Russian culture and did some things, little role-playing exercises to get ready for things. We had some funny results from that. For example, we were told, Americans are very punctual, time is important, and the Russians don't have that same view of the clock. And so we had one negotiating session where, we went in for our morning session at Roscosmos. We broke for lunch. We left the building, went out, had lunch. And when we came back, every other day when we came in, the guards would make us wait for an escort before going up to the conference room. And on this day, the guards, I guess they were used to seeing us come in at this point, so they just said, go on through. So we said, well, okay. So we went on through, and we went back to the conference room we'd been in the morning, and the door was locked. So we're kind of milling around in the hall. No Russians. We're looking at our watch. No Russians. Periodically, we'd send our interpreter off to go check and see where they were. Still no Russians. So we're all kind of joking about, oh, good thing we had that course so we know not to be upset, and this is perfectly normal, and so on. And then it turned out they had moved to another conference room, and the whole time they were promptly there on time waiting for us to show up and be escorted in. So that was a little bit interesting. But one of the things that we did as a technique on the delegation is, when you're the lead negotiator like I was, you really have to stay very, very focused on the lead that you're talking to. And what they're saying, you have to listen very attentively so you can have a reply ready for any arguments that you need to respond to or answer questions. And so you can't see everything that's going on. You'd be distracted, and that wouldn't be helpful. But your delegation can. So I used my delegation to keep track of body language, pick up clues on what were hot button issues, and that helped us then, this one's really important to them. This one, they had one person they'd turn to talk that we joked about him being put on auto chat because he'd just go on and on. So when they turned it over to him and let him go, they were just stalling for time, and this wasn't an important issue. We started picking up those clues, and using the whole delegation to observe was important. But I still was surprised at the very end of the negotiations because there were maybe 4 points that had been sticking points for probably 2 years, that I had non-negotiable U.S. positions, had to get them in, could not get the Russians to agree. Alex and I were tired of saying our talking points at one another. We could have switched roles easily. We'd been through it so many times. And we got to this one negotiating session, and whatever they had done internally to be ready to accept the agreement at that point had been done. And so I raised this point expecting the usual reply, and Alex said, no problem. Okay. Next point, no problem. And I'm sitting there thinking, who is this man and what has he done with Alex Krasnov? Mm-hmm. But that was the end of the negotiations. And so in retrospect, I learned that was part of their negotiating technique, was pick an issue that the Americans feel really strongly about, that they're going to fight hard for and never compromise on, and that's your stall tactic. Okay, until we've done everything we need to do domestically to be ready and have worked all the other issues. And I was absolutely convinced those were real issues for them, and in the end, they weren't.
I think the other challenge is you just think of the change that they were going through. You know, they had just dissolved from the Soviet Union into Russia, and you know, they had to go off and write treaties with Kazakhstan for their launches, and so we were in the middle of watching all this process as they were going through this real political tumult and their own funding issues. I mean, we knew that a lot of the folks that we were working with maybe wouldn't get paid. They certainly wouldn't get paid regularly. But they still, you know, because they shared that passion that we had, they still kept working. They still kept the mission going.
Up to now, we've been able to talk about some challenges you guys have faced, some very difficult challenges, and how you've been able to work through them. Can you guys talk about a situation where you've worked a difficult problem that failed, what you learned from that situation, and how you recovered, regained confidence, credibility, and moved on?
Have you ever failed?
Sure. Plenty of times. First and foremost, you have to be willing to really honestly dissect what you've done and what the realities of the situation were. When you know, is it something that you just didn't have the right information, or is it something that you just misunderstood and you were never going to find the right path to take? Now, there's also situations where you may be put in a box of doing that, and I guess, you know, one of my more notable ones was Mr. Golden strongly disagreed with the decision of the Russians to fly Dennis Tito to the space station. So I was put in the position of leading the entire partnership to challenge that decision. We knew all along the Russians were going to fly Dennis. There was no question. We knew that they needed the money. We knew that they had the rights to be able to do that, but we had to work the system to do that. And then, kind of as Lynn talked about in her other international negotiations, we also knew how to find a path to soften that decision, and we ended up using the Stafford-Utkin group to do a review of the whole process and come up with some mitigations that were acceptable to the partners. And then, frankly, afterwards, we actually, a handful of us had a debriefing session with Tito and talked about what it had looked like from his view, what had NASA done, and how had the Russians reacted. It was actually a fascinating discussion with Dennis.
Yeah, I think it's important to, you know, not take it too personally and internalize it, and figure out what the lessons are learned. And when something's fresh in your mind, that may be really hard to do. You might be too emotional, but a little bit later, you can really be more reflective and objective about it, and you've got to kind of clear the air and get to that point.
Okay. As I expected, the time has gone very fast. You've both had incredible careers, and appreciate here, as you've done many times before, sharing many of your thoughts and experiences. So let's thank Lynn Cline and Mike Hawes. And I want to thank our audience here at NASA headquarters, and particularly the members of the NASA First class. Hope you have a wonderful experience here. Appreciate the questions and wish you a wonderful career. I want to thank NASA TV, and again, thank all of you for joining us here, and hope you'll join us in the future for some of our Academy activities. So thank you.